Okay, so now we are on to the stress gradient hypothesis. So we just covered sort of what mutualisms are, right? Mutualisms, commensalisms, facilitation more broadly is this part of the interaction diagram, right? We have the zeros, we have the pluses. It's the positive interactions, right? And we've covered that these can be facultative, meaning that partners don't need to interact with each other to survive, or they can be obligate, meaning the survival of each party is contingent on that interaction. And then we've covered that the outcomes of these interactions depend on ecological context. And there's a really neat case, one actually that faculty, myself, and Dr. Fernandez in Davie are working on, and a bunch of other faculty actually. This is a really common hypothesis in ecology called the stress gradient hypothesis. So the stress gradient hypothesis, plainly said, is that positive interactions, so commensalisms and mutualisms, are more common in highly stressful environments than negative interactions, right? And they're relatively more common than in very unstressful environments. Said simply, when stress goes up, positive interactions go up, right? One of the clear textbook cases of this has to do with desert plants. So you can imagine a desert where it never rains, right? And it's extraordinarily sunny, and that sun dries you out because all of the stuff we covered in chapter 3. You have to keep your stomata open, you haven't evolved CAM photosynthesis or C4 photosynthesis, you're drying out all the time, so all that incident radiation on you is causing transpiration, all those things we've talked about. In those cases, we have things called nurse plants, right? A nurse plant is a larger plant that can handle the transpiration losses of high incident radiation, and in its shadow actually increases the growth of plants below it, right? Does that make sense to y'all? Why would this have to do with the stress gradient hypothesis? Well, imagine a situation where this incident radiation, this high stressor, this thing that's causing tons of transpiration and all this water stress wasn't there. If we got rid of that, then we have direct resource competition, and we move back to chapter 12. We have a negative-negative interaction, right? And this is the sort of foundational concept behind the stress gradient hypothesis, is that partners nearby that you interact with, they don't have to be nearby, but partners that you interact with in highly stressful environments can lessen that stress. And because mutualisms are a balance of costs and benefits, can actually tip interactions from commensalism, from competition, to mutualism, right? And this is a really spectacularly cool hypothesis, especially given the current world we live in that is changing rapidly. And so we have all sorts of neat hypotheses about how facilitation and competition among co-flowering species at the tops of mountains might be changing given environments are becoming more stressful, right? So read that example in your textbook. There's a really nice example of alpine plants and their interactions shifting between sort of mutualism and competition depending on stress. One of the things we're thinking about in South Florida, right, is the idea that mangroves, these critical ecosystems of South Florida, are facing all kinds of new stressors, sort of anthropogenic via humans, via global change. Things are getting warmer, storms are getting more intense. And we're at FAU really interested in investigating how associations with microbes might be shifting along that stress gradient. And so this is a very special case of context dependence. Context dependence. And I think it highlights how ecological theory develops. T-E-D-E-P-E-N-D-E-N-C-E. Geez, I am terrible at spelling. How ecological theory develops, right? Context dependence, the idea that interactions, the outcomes of interactions depend on the abiotic and biotic context that they're happening in, is a broad idea, right? It's not very specific. It's just like, hey, things are different in different places. The stress gradient hypothesis is slightly more specific. It's saying not just do the outcomes differ by context, but in some contexts we predict that facilitation will be more common than competition, right? And this is sort of how ecological theory builds upon itself. This is a theoretical predictive framework that you could generate hypotheses from. And really, is the theoretical, sort of exemplifies how theory builds to experiments, right? We could go out and design an experiment where we block the sun and test if this little plant does worse or better. We can change that stress by growing these plants in greenhouses where we manipulate how much water they have. And these are the experimental tests that have shown that the stress gradient hypothesis has some good support, right? This is building its way up to a stress gradient theory or whatever. But you can experimentally change the stress of an environment and look at the outcome of interactions. And that's a thing we might ask you to do on an exam, not exam 2, which clearly is open now, but maybe exam 3. So think that through. Think about how you would test the outcome of a mutualism. Would you measure the fitness of each party? Would you remove each party? We talked about, designing experiments to test competition. How would that look different if you were trying to test mutualisms? How would that look different if you were trying to test whether the stress gradient hypothesis is acting in this system that you're interested in or not? Cool. Okay, so we did context dependence, we did stress gradients. Let's keep it rolling.